Hello, I'm Benjamin Miss, and this is the second part of our discussion on research and ethics, focusing on ethics. Welcome to Introduction to Psychology. We start our discussion of ethics by considering the principles of human research and how these things came about. We'll do this by looking at some wildly unethical studies and how we've learned to protect people through this process. So the principles that we consider now are freedom from coercion. This means you can't make somebody do your study. Nobody can be forced to do a study. And situations where coercion is likely due to power dynamics, you consider that you would have extra protections. You have informed consent. What this means is specific to risks. If there's any risks, people have to be informed. This works with the idea of minimal deception because it is possible to lie in research. It is possible to mislead your research participants because you have to. You have to in order for them to adequately be involved in a research study. So, for instance, there's a researcher who does work on false memory. And if you know who the researcher is, you know that they're basically trying to affect your memory, and this could influence your responses. So you have to maintain some things to be a little bit hidden. However, even if you can't be completely upfront with all the information, you still have to make sure that the risks are clear. Adequate debriefing means that after it's done, the participants should know what the purpose of the study was and value. This could be things like, especially related to deception, letting people know that they were misled for science. And of course, confidentiality. Confidentiality means that your data that was collected about you, nobody should ever have access to that outside the specific research study. This means that when researchers design a study, they have to be very careful about how they do these things. With animals, it's interesting how things have changed. Historically, animals were used very kind of casually in research without a lot of controls. Early research involved things like, cutting into animal brains to see what would happen without strong predictions. Partly it was a lack of information about the brain, but partly it involved kind of repetitive things that didn't really add anything to research. So when you consider research with animals, you have to consider necessity, right? So what has been done and what's the reason for doing this? You can certainly do almost anything, but it's got to be clearly justified and have scientific benefit. The health of the animals must be maintained through and after research, and they must be treated humanely. There were cases decades ago of students freeing, it's an odd word to use, but letting animals out of cages in research facilities. And it's easy to sympathize with those students and say, these animals were not being treated humanely. So there are a lot of protections, especially at the university level, for working with animals, and it is important to maintain that. We learn a lot from this kind of research, but we do have to be cautious. When we look at how research has changed over time, we go back to 1939, and we look at a study called the Monster Study. This was run by Wendell Johnson, a pioneering expert in speech research. Well, Wendell Johnson believed that stuttering was caused by psychological pressure while learning to speak. Well, how would you study this? If this is what you believe, and you can kind of do whatever you want because there's no real ethical controls, you might think to yourself, hey, if we put children who are learning to speak under psychological pressure, we can show that it causes stuttering. Under modern standards, this is a terrible study. And under any standards, this is wildly unethical. It gets even worse. It was performed under a university's umbrella, and they used orphans. 1939, Great Depression, wartime, they used orphans, and they subjected them to horrible, highly critical treatment, and the orphans ended up stuttering. They reported long-term speech problems and insecurity, and it's a very sad situation. Johnson did attempt to undo some of this damage, and there are reports that he did feel bad about it later when he realized this was a horrible idea. But it doesn't undo the damage that was done, and we do need to consider maintaining ethics in research. We consider, is it ethical to experiment on prisoners? What do you think? Yes or no? Well, kind of. So you would think, well, people are in jail. Why not allow them the opportunity to participate in research? You could pay them. You could give them opportunities for, special privileges. And that's part of the issue. That counts very heavily as coercion, right? The more desperate you are, the more likely you are to be coerced. And prisoners aren't considered to have consent. They aren't considered to be able to give full consent, which is part of the issue. Is it ethical to hurt people a little for the greater good? What do you think? The answer is yes. Now you have to have a real good reason for it, and any pain or discomfort you're going to cause has to be justified very carefully, and all of this has to be gone through review boards, and we'll go over what that means. Should we allow poor people who need the money to go into research that might be dangerous? What do you think? This is related to the first question, isn't it? Coercion. Desperation. Would you take a risky drug that could cause you a permanent movement disorder? Probably not. But how desperate are you? Do you have starving children? Are you barely going to make the rent? So we have to be very cautious about how much is paid for things like this. In fact, some companies go overseas to do highly unethical things because we do have fairly good controls at this time, though we will be talking about how that's changed and how we didn't always. Can we watch people without their knowing it? Well, the answer to this one is, yeah, we do it all the time. It just depends on where. It would certainly be interesting to put cameras in people's homes without their knowing it, to see how people behave in private. It would also be horribly unethical. So, public places, sure, where there's not the expectation of privacy. And what about making people uncomfortable? Sure, as long as there's a good reason for it with adequate debriefing. Overall, we're trying to balance these two ideas: protecting participants, upholding human rights. But we also want to learn stuff about us, about society. And so it's a balance between these principles that must be maintained. Well, there's things that can happen that go beyond this kind of balance, such as research fraud. Sometimes data will be manipulated or even made up. This is horrible, and it's one of those things that damages the public trust in science. It is quite rare, but these cases also tend to make the news. And I'll show you some examples of that. And then we'll consider plagiarism. Well, what about using someone else's ideas or words without giving them credit? And how can research be unethical but also be legal? Sometimes it has to do with changing times. So here's an example of scientific misconduct, which was basically research fraud, falsifying data. Here was a researcher that basically pretended they had a cancer detection technique that worked, but they did not. And it caused a great deal of problems, and they basically stole millions of dollars in research funding that could have gone to good research that was actually doing what it said it was doing. And how about how things have changed? Just like the Tuskegee syphilis study, something similar happened in Guatemala, run by the U.S. government, and it was not considered to be unethical or at the time or problematic, and yet they basically infected people with diseases and let them pass them on in order to study it. They may have thought they had a good reason for it, and yet this is horrible when we look at this. When we look at plagiarism, clearly not on the same scale as some of these research abuses, but things have changed over time here too. For instance, Thomas Jefferson borrowed directly from John Locke when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, pulling very clear ideas. But at the time, it wasn't like people had read that many, there weren't that many books to read. And educated people had all read the same stuff. So in reading this, people would probably say, oh, yes, I see that old Thomas Jefferson got this from John Locke. What a good idea to use it here. Today, you have to clearly make it known where you got your information from. But due to literary aspects, I'm not sure how this would affect. We also consider cases of when people were forced to be subjects and what that means. Well, you cannot force someone to be a subject. Many of these were historical, and yet really not that long ago. Classic examples are Germany and Japan, World War II, concentration camps, and medical research. Horrible things, monstrous things were done to prisoners that had no ability to give consent or protect themselves. Removing people's arms to place them on the other side, torturing people, seeing how long they could live with their skin removed. Horrible, monstrous things that were done for what they said was science, but have no value. And even if they had value, could never be done. But these were outside of the United States. In the U.S. are the rest of these. Vanderbilt, 1940, researchers gave pregnant women radioactive iron. Now you're thinking, why in the world would they do this? Well, there were researchers developing bombs and studying radiation, and they thought this would be a good study. Clearly, no controls to protect people. Clearly, allowing researchers to do what they thought was perhaps for the greater good, without considering the rights of the individual. We must always consider the rights of the individual. When we consider Willowbrook Hospital, this was coercion at its absolute worst. You took people who were severely disabled and living with family, and the families needed assistance. And so the hospital would say, well, we don't have any beds, but if you enroll them in this study, hey, we have some special beds put aside, or, oh, look, a bed just opened up. So you've got people who are desperate for care, and they would enroll them in this study because they had no other option. It was either, nothing or this. And in this study, they were giving people basically hepatitis to try out a new treatment that didn't even end up working, right? Not that the outcome mattered, but they were basically feeding people tainted food so that they would develop hepatitis for the study. Again, horrible. The possibly worst of these studies, and most well known, likely in the United States, was the Tuskegee syphilis study that was run from 1928 to 1972. And there were treatments for syphilis throughout this time period. But the researchers were doing it on specifically African American men in the South, in Tuskegee, and thinking, no one's going to complain, nobody's going to care. They might have told themselves, hey, we're giving them free medical care, we're just not treating this. But what they wanted to see was the long-term effects of syphilis and how it was passed on to their family members. This monstrous attempt at research lasted way beyond the development of penicillin and other cures, and led to the untimely deaths for many. In fact, the Tuskegee study was the most influential in stopping this kind of research and creating very clear controls. Then you have the Humphreys tea room sex study, which was more recent. This was, but still done at the time when homosexuality was considered to be a disease, and people who engaged in homosexual activity were considered to be vagrants, criminals, unemployable. Humphreys went and observed, and basically would observe, typical men going to public, restrooms and having sex, and then he would follow them, get their information, had a friend at the DMV who would give him addresses. Yeah, and here's where we get into the real unethical stuff. Would go to their houses in disguise and interview them about something else, just to find out about their lives. And what he found was interesting. These were typical average people who often had families and were living a secret life because it could not be who they were. And yet it is still unethical because even though it brought information that was useful, it was dangerous, and it forced people to participate in a study that they did not agree to. The last one is an example of the U.S. military kind of doing whatever they want, and some aspects of this are just really well designed in an almost hilarious way. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, MK Ultra involved trying to use, open up aspects of the mind, do mind control, psychic stuff. They made a movie about it. The Men Who Stare at Goats followed some aspects of this. And so what they did was, one of the studies that was actually interesting in its design, horribly unethical, but in a kind of a clever way. So what they did was they took these, they created fake brothels, and one was in New York. They created a fake brothel, right, a place where men would go to hire women to have sex. And when the men went there, they would say, "Oh, hey, why don't you wait here for a minute, have a drink, and we'll get started." So the proprietors would have them sit down, and they dosed them with LSD. The military also dosed service members with LSD, but the rights of soldiers is quite different. Here we're talking about members of the public. Now, the reason for the cleverness here is if you were going to pay for sex and somebody dosed you with LSD, who are you going to tell? Are you going to go into work on Monday and tell your friends, I went to a brothel on Saturday, and can you believe it? They gave me LSD while I was waiting. I had this bad trip, and it was just a bad experience. No one's going to do that. So you end up with this kind of, you got to mess with people, study how this drug affected them, and they're not going to say a word about it. But again, we're looking at things in the United States and what happened. Well, modern protections, I mentioned prisoners earlier, patients, your medical people cannot experiment on you without extra protections. They can, but they have to get extra consent, and there's extra rules to follow. Prisoners are not considered to have full consent. You can do research on them, but it generally needs to be research about prisoners, not just research in general, and children. Children are highly protected, When we look at government guidelines, the Belmont report came out after, remember, the Tuskegee syphilis study ended in 1972 due to public outcry because people were like, what in the world is happening? And it was in 1979 that it was put together basically a report that acted as a guide for the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. Now, the IRB reviews studies that come into a university or a college or anything. And so basically a bunch of people sit down, look at the study and say, is this ethical? I participate as part of a review board, and I've done this for a while. And it's interesting to see, because what you want to make sure is, well, are you protected? Are you protecting people, and are you doing anything that could cause ethical or problematic issues? And so the whole point is you got like a bunch of people in the room who aren't involved with the study. So they don't have anything like tied in. And if I want to do research, I need to leave the room, right? And then they talk about the study and review it without me, because the whole point is to have an independent board that's behaving ethically. So this is that guide. This is how the IRB works. And this came out of the horrible unethical stuff. Now, what we also see is sometimes you might see research as being not shared. So here is a study in 2002 that talked about how a government administration was basically refusing to publish good research or share research that they had worked on because it didn't fit their beliefs. It didn't fit their policies. Highly problematic. But now we're getting outside of the lab and research and getting into how other areas manipulate this kind of thing. When we look at the 3 key principles of the Belmont Report for human research, you have respect, beneficence, and justice. So let's look at each of these things. Respect means autonomy. In a way, you have the right to make your own decisions. I can't force you to be involved in a study, right? I can't basically, like Humphreys, follow you and observe your sexual behavior and then do research on you without your consent, right? You can't lie to people, and hide risk. Beneficence is there's got to be some possible reasonable outcome. And a lot of research that students do, the outcome is we might learn something. It's very, very low for risk-free research. If you're having someone fill out a survey about something that's not controversial, there's very, very, very much you can do. But anytime you increase the risk, perhaps there's pain, perhaps there's uncomfortability, you have to have more reason for it. You have to have more justification for it in order to have these kinds of protections for your participants. And this is important too. So the more risk, the more possible benefit. You can't guarantee a benefit, but if you have a possible benefit, hey, here's a drug that could cause, severe risk of maybe medical issues, but it could also cure some type of cancer, right? You consider, well, what's the benefit to risk ratio? And people have to sit down and consider, do the possible benefits outweigh the very real risks? Justice is about why you can't pay poor people to engage in risky research. You can't shift the burden. In addition, people who are low income may have other issues, right? They might not be representative of the population in terms of their health, in terms of their nutrition. So you want to make sure that you are, kind of spreading out that risk, testing a good group. And payment can be, highly influential. So justice means everybody should be able to be involved. And it also is good that way. Now, I've got a couple studies, more recent, right? So these came out in the 1960s and 1970s that have been used as examples of ethics. And I think that there's something very interesting here too, because I don't think that they are the same, in terms of ethics. So let's take a look at what they were. The Stanford Prison Study and the Milgram Experiment. The Stanford Prison Study was run by Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University. And what they did is they made movies about both of these recently, by the way. They took students, young male students who signed up for a 2-week study to be paid some money over basically the summer break. And they were randomly assigned to be either prisoners or guards. The guards worked 8-hour shifts, went home, went about their lives. The prisoners were kept in a effective prison the entire time. Now, they could leave. They weren't locked in, but it wasn't really clear that they could do so, right? So, and the guards were told to just behave as guards. And what happened is people took on these roles, and it's been used as an example of roles. In some ways, it kind of mimics what happened at Abu Ghraib, where you had American service members who were guards treating these prisoners horribly because they were basically told these are bad people, they're trying to kill you, and they effectively tortured them, humiliated them, right? People took on the roles that they thought they were supposed to take on. And in a lot of ways, we see this. It's interesting. And yet, what did we learn from it? Well, one of the people involved, one of the people who was in the study, believes that it was a horrible study that ended up creating this idea of evil, right, in people, where they were influenced by the design and by the research. Zimbardo, the researcher in charge, has been heavily involved in very positive things for a long time, right, and promoting some very good aspects of research. And yet, we kind of ignore how unethical this study is. The study could never be replicated. Right? Because even though there weren't any real locks on the doors, there were psychological things in place that created this prison, right? The prison guards with their mirrored sunglasses and their uniforms, the prisoners with this feeling of helplessness, And there were mental breakdowns over the course of this. The other one that's interesting is the Milgram experiment. And the Milgram experiment, I'm not sure if it's as in the same kind of thing, because it was earlier and it really upset people. It was very controversial, a lot of disagreement about the ethics of it. And yet, when we look at it, the outcome, the possible outcome and the very real outcome was staggering and echoes to our current times. Let's look at the design. We see Stanley Milgram there, and he's standing by this shock indicator. And so what the person would do is basically give someone else shocks, or they believed they were. Nobody ever got shocks except for a test shock on the person giving the shocks. I know that sounds a little odd. So E stands for experimenter, T for teacher, and L for learner. And there was a wall. There was a separate room. So the teacher could hear the learner through the wall, but the learner was listening through a microphone. So they were told is two people came into the room. The learner, however, was in cahoots with the experimenter. So the only person being tested wasn't the learner, it was the teacher. So they would put two pieces of paper into a hat. Each person would take a piece of paper. Both papers said teacher. The learner, however, would always say, "Oh, I'm the learner," and just toss their paper away because they were in on the experiment. The teacher believed that they were going to be teaching the learner. And they were shown, hey, here's what a test shock feels like. And they were given a brief shock. The learner then went to the other room. After the teacher saw them hooked up to the machine, the learner unhooked themselves and began to play a record. This was back then, right? And so it would give their responses. The teacher would then read a list of words, and the whole point, they were told that they were teaching punishment. How does punishment help somebody learn? So they would read a list of words, and if the learner got it right, nothing would happen. If they got it wrong, they'd get a shock. And they eventually got shocked more and more. And as these shocks, as the teacher believed they were giving shocks, the learner, the recording, would start shouting about, "I have a heart problem," or "Get me out of here," or "I don't want to do this anymore. I demand to be let go." And the teacher might feel uncomfortable. And the experimenter would say something like, "The experiment must continue. You've been given your instructions." And the experimenter took responsibility, putting the teacher into a position, the person actually being studied, where they were told they're not responsible for the outcome. Even after, and over here to the right of this shock box image, these were like XXX, dangerous, deadly shock levels. More than half of the people who participated in this experiment went all the way. 2/3 nearly went all the way. And most people went to the point where the learner was screaming in pain. What does this tell us? Well, Milgram did care about the outcomes of his teachers, how they felt afterwards. In fact, many of them may have been, this was in the shortly after World War II, many of them may have been overseas and seen the horrors of the Nazis. Milgram was inspired by this because he saw we had this very strong attitude about the German people, that they were just bad or wrong and had perpetrated these horrific crimes. Why had the average person committed these crimes? What created an average person to commit horrible hate and war crimes? Well, when somebody says you're not responsible, when a government says you're doing the right thing, what happens? Well, people seem to do what they're told. And when they are told they're not responsible and given instructions, they want to do well. Milgram was also influenced by a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt. And the book was about Adolf Eichmann, who was a functionary who helped to send Jews to their deaths. And he wanted to do a good job. And when he was testifying before his execution, he was talking about how he was great at his job. He was great at his job of exterminating Jews, and yet he was a boring dude who was just doing paperwork, who aggrandized his involvement. He wasn't even as involved as he said he was. And Arendt, the title was The Banality of Evil. Banality being this kind of like boring, nothing special about this guy. He was just like an average guy. And, when you think of someone who's responsible for thousands of deaths, hundreds of thousands even, you think of a monster. And yet, just a paper pusher, filling out forms and trying to do a good job. What Milgram wanted to see was, what would it take to get an average person to commit horrible acts, to hurt somebody? And what he found was, it didn't take that much. Now, people were freaked out. They were extremely unhappy with Milgram's results because they didn't like to think that this is actually something that could happen. He ended up losing his position at Yale. He got another position in New York. But Milgram was a brilliant researcher, very thoughtful, and had an artistic side in his research design. Other studies he's done were also quite interesting, but this is the one that he is most famous for. So what we see with ethics and research, we see, are we protecting people? Well, what did we learn from Milgram? Could we do a study like Milgram today? I think so. I do, because if you have the proper controls in place, including adequate debriefing and even therapeutic interventions for the teacher, you could do something like this. For something like the prison experiment, not so much, because it wasn't a very clear design. It was more, let's see what happens under these circumstances, that turned out to be quite problematic. So that kind of concludes our discussion of research and ethics, but it should give us a good idea of research design, how we know what we know, and how we protect people while being able to do psychology research and learn about the mind and about who we are. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. Thank you, and I look forward to future discussions.